and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-Jung Cho. The U.S. and South Korea held extended deterrence talks in Washington and had extensive discussions on deterring North Korea. Today we discuss how the talks may evolve in the face of rapidly deteriorating security in the region. We also look at ways to maintain cooperation between Korea and Japan.
Any DPRK nuclear attack on the United States or its allies and partners is unacceptable and will result in the end of that regime.
특히 최초로 북핵 위협 상황을 가정한 시나리오 기반의 토의를 실시함으로써 실제 적용할 수 있는 다양한 방안들을 모색하는 시간을 가졌습니다.
전술핵 재배치를 포함한 핵무장은 현재로서는 한국 정부의 입장이 아닙니다.
In the studio with me, Mr. Bruce Klingner, Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Klingner spent 20 years at the Central Intelligence Agency and the Defense Intelligence Agency and served as CIA's Deputy Division Chief for Korea. Also joining us, Mr. Sidney Seiler, Senior Advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mr. Seiler was former National Intelligence Officer for North Korea on the National Intelligence Council. Mr. Seiler was the Special Envoy for Six-Party Talks and National Security Council Korea Director during the Obama administration. Mr. Seiler also served as Senior Analyst for U.S. Forces Korea. Mr. Seiler has worked on North Korea issues for over 40 years. Welcome to the program.
Well, thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Klingner, the fifth meeting of the Extended Deterrence Strategy and Consultation Group was held in Washington. What are the new achievements in this meeting, and how will the EDSCG evolve, taking into account the rapidly deteriorating security environment in the region, including the China and North Korea's nuclear breakout and closer ties between North Korea and Russia?
Well, when you look at the joint statement from the group, it's typically bland. It's very hard to discern from the statement itself what is new or what has been achieved. The details are behind closed doors, so we're not quite sure. But I think more importantly, it's part of a trend since last year with the very successful U.S.-South Korea summit, the Washington Declaration, and then also the Camp David agreement with Japan. So the trend has been on both reassuring our South Korean ally, deterring North Korea, as well as engaging with our two allies in Northeast Asia to increase sort of joint operations or joint coordination on policy. So we may not know the details, but certainly the trend line is very positive, and I think it will be in the future.
And Mr. Seiler, for the first time, officials from United States and South Korea discussed scenario in which North Korea uses nuclear weapons. What do you think is behind such first discussion? And also, the United States reiterated that any use of nuclear weapons by North Korea against the United States or its allies will result in the end of the regime. And some U.S. analysts are very concerned about that comment, and some even say that that's a mistake in U.S. policy. Do you agree with that?
Well, while this may be the first time there was a scenarios-based discussion held within the EDSCG, it certainly is not the first time we have had discussions with our Korean allies, together, our two sides, about the various manifestations. First of all, about the capabilities North Korea brings to the table. Their long range, their intermediate, their short range ballistic missiles, the development of capabilities that could target South Korea. These are developments that have unfolded over the past several years or even a few decades, ones that we have always considered in our military planning, we've always discussed. So it can be misleading to see the current situation as an acceleration of a growth of North Korea's program that we are now newly addressing for the first time. The comment on whether regime termination is justified as a response to North Korea's nuclear use is an interesting point. Many people often like to highlight that early elimination of the leadership might end to early termination of a conflict, or conversely, without the leadership, you have nobody with whom to negotiate. And so you want to avoid giving the impression that you're going after leadership. You want to leave them an exit ramp. And I understand all those arguments, but I think at this time more than ever before, North Korea needs to understand its nuclear weapons are of no value to their national security. They're certainly not needed from a defensive perspective because, with the U.S. and the ROK maintaining peace on the peninsula for 7 decades, seeking an improvement of relations with North Korea that it rejects. We know that the defensive drivers between North Korea's nuclear program are probably very small. And from an offensive perspective, if Kim Jong-un believes he can use these weapons to achieve strategic objectives, he needs to know that he won't. And I think the U.S. language in that regard, in terms of it spelling an end to the regime that uses these weapons, is a helpful element of our declaratory language that serves our deterrence strategy.
And Mr. Klingner, to give more assurance to allies in the theater and to deter North Korea and China, some people in Washington, the experts, are saying the U.S. should consider redeploying tactical nuclear weapons into the theater. And Senators James Risch and Roger Wicker also endorses this plan openly. And growing number of U.S. experts on this program are now more open to the idea than just couple or last year. Can this option be implemented in the near future?
I don't think in the near future. I think the proponents of it would need to identify what specific measures or how does it specifically increase deterrence beyond the U.S. strategic weapons as well as the tactical nuclear weapons that certainly would be in theater during a crisis. They would be on very hard to locate and target airplanes and ships and submarines. Also, implementing it would have a number of downsides. Having tactical U.S. nuclear weapons in a static bunker in South Korea makes a very juicy preemptive target for North Korea. It's sort of a hit-me-first target, and it may even lead during a crisis to North Korea to be more likely to want to target that because they know it is such a valuable target. Also, the Yoon administration has repeatedly said they are not interested in U.S. reintroducing tactical nuclear weapons, and that if the U.S. were to raise that or push for that option, it could cause a diplomatic situation with our ally or strains in the alliance. When you think of the large-scale demonstrations in South Korea against introducing the defensive THAAD missile system, having offensive nuclear weapons on South Korean soil would likely create a very strong domestic issue for our South Korean ally. And also, then South Korea would also wonder, does this create a strong diplomatic crisis or situation with Beijing, which may not want tactical nuclear weapons on South Korean soil?
I also want to hear Mr. Seiler's opinion, but before that, proponents say that if U.S. nuclear weapon is in the theater, then U.S. can respond more quickly to North Korea and China's escalation. And when it comes to storage of the tactical U.S. nuclear weapons on Korean Peninsula, it'll most likely be in large U.S. troops complexes like Kunsan. So that'll be North Korea's target anyways, whether it has nuclear weapons or not.
Well, on speed of response, with U.S. strategic weapons can be on target in 33 minutes or so. And then tactical nuclear weapons are in theater or would be in theater during a crisis. And those would be very hard to locate if they're on submarines, aircraft carriers, airplanes, et cetera. So we would already have a very strong nuclear deterrent along with our conventional deterrent as well as our commitment to our allies to fulfill our treaty obligations.
Right, and then the target.
We know that U.S. bases as well as South Korean bases would already be targets, but having the tactical nuclear weapons there in a bunker may make it a even more inviting target during a preemption scenario by North Korea. If they know that they can get a lot of U.S. nuclear weapons prior to them being deployed on aircraft or whether they would be going back out to the maritime platforms.
And Mr. Seiler, you're advisor to U.S. Forces Korea. What do you think?
So, Bruce hits it right on the head. I sometimes, when I hear from advocates of the redeployment of the nuclear weapons to the peninsula, deep down is a desire that there are vulnerable U.S. targets that would be hit early on so that we would have no choice but to come to the assistance of the Republic of Korea in time of North Korea on nuclear attack. And that just shows kind of the not crisis, but the difficulties in reassuring the Korean people that even without these weapons on the peninsula, we have more than enough capabilities, and we can do so in a very sophisticated manner while avoiding all the escalatory, either strategic escalatory with China or the tactical escalatory, should those weapons be on the ground during a North Korean attack. That we can do this so much smarter with the current arsenal that we have not deployed on the peninsula. And there's no real gain to be had from a deterrence perspective in having those weapons actually on the peninsula.
And people say nuclear weapons are the ultimate deterrence. If U.S. nuclear weapon is in the theater, then it will give less motivation for North Korea and China to escalate.
Well, the nuclear weapons are one part of the extended deterrence guarantee, which is nuclear weapons, conventional forces, as well as missile defenses. So it really is all part of the package. And the capabilities are one half of it. And as I mentioned before, the U.S. resolve. So having forces on the peninsula is already a sign of our commitment. And certainly if any of them are injured or killed, then that is a very strong indication that the U.S. would respond. And then in the statement that the use of a North Korean nuclear weapon would lead to the end of the regime if it is used against U.S. or South Korean forces. So sometimes it's an intangible thing of how many of a certain kind of weapon do you need, or what statements do you need to our ally. It's not always necessarily a very black and white issue of if only you had this number of weapons, or if you only place them here, it is the ultimate deterrent.
But because South Korea is surrounded by nuclear powers, those proponents of nuclear drive want nuclear weapons on South Korean soil. And if United States was in South Korea's shoes, United States, which seeks perfect security, would not rely on an ally's weapon, but want its own weapons.
We've all heard that argument, and it's an argument worth having. And while I believe that the discussions so far have not fully convinced me that this indigenous nuclear capability fills some gap right now, I do believe this is an important discussion to have going forward. In part because the logic of the U.S. nuclear deterrent, of the extended deterrent to the Republic of Korea, and why it's in everyone's best interest. We need to all be fluid in it, other than just saying we don't want any more nuclear powers. I think both Bruce and I have talked about, in particular, how China would respond to an emerging nuclear in Korea. What would Japan's posture be, nuclear South Korea? What would Japan's posture be in response to a nuclearizing South Korea? And, in the process of pursuing these capabilities, Kim Jong-un could see this as his last chance to use the weapons that they have spent so much, that they have invested in so much to have to establish what they perceive as some type of at least balance of power, if not dominance on the peninsula. The potential for a North-South conflict to erupt simply because the ROK moves down the nuclear path is a scenario that we need to be attentive to. And so this is why we have so many mechanisms right now. EDSCG allows us to discuss this. A nuclear consultative group allows us to build confidence in our Republic of Korea partners that we think through these issues, that we have plans, we have capabilities, and we have resolve. We demonstrate resolve. The ROK moving down the road of nuclear capability would be a demonstration of a belief that the U.S. does not have resolve. And that would be the wrong signal to send as well.
And Mr. Seiler, Principal Deputy National Security Advisor Kim Tae-hyo said that U.S. security umbrella could be weakened if former President Trump gets reelected, and the second Trump administration may seek to discuss the cost of deploying strategic assets to South Korea. Aren't Kim's comments more of a hint at future nuclear weapons development by South Korea rather than a concern over a change of government in Washington?
Well, first of all, I have absolute respect for Kim Tae-hyo. He is a strategic thinker who has proven a great amount of expertise in navigating these waters for the past decade or so. I think what Deputy National Security Office Director Kim is hinting at is that there might be changes under under Donald Trump that the Republic of Korea will need to prepare for. It's still very premature to understand what those changes might be. I think in terms of Donald Trump definitely sees alliances differently, but I think people worry about the worst case manifestations, that somehow he's an isolationist, that alliances that don't pay their share will lose U.S. forces. I don't believe that a President Trump would be inclined towards actions that would destabilize the peninsula. And also, when you look at President Trump's engagement with North Korea during his first term of office, it was a very different period. It was a different North Korea, first of all. And second, it was during an administration in the Republic of Korea under Moon Jae-in that was encouraging us to engage with the North, that was encouraging us to roll back our military exercises, that was encouraging us to curtail strategic asset deployments. Those factors are all gone, so it would be a very different environment. So getting back to what Deputy Director Kim mentioned, there will be elements of a Trump approach to the Korean Peninsula that will require thinking across a range of capabilities and posture. But to say that necessarily Trump administration would see a weakening of the U.S. nuclear umbrella or extended deterrence commitment to the Republic of Korea is a little bit of an overstate, or it's too early to tell. I think that's a safe way to say it. We'll have to wait till next year to see that.
And Mr. Klingner, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan visited China last week. He reiterated that complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula is the goal. Many South Koreans believe that U.S. government's definition of complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula include containing the possibility of South Korea going nuclear. They point out that even at a time when denuclearizing North Korea seems impossible, the United States is denying South Korea's aspirations for nuclear weapons. Is this a fair assessment? If this is the idea of denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula, there's really no reason for China to object to this, right?
Well, when we had negotiations with North Korea and previous agreements, the U.S. agreed to the North Korean term of denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula rather than denuclearization of North Korea. At the time, it was clear that there were no nuclear weapons in South Korea, either U.S. or any South Korean indigenous program. So as a way of perhaps giving face to North Korea, we agreed to the Korean Peninsula as the terminology. So a South Korean program, which President Yoon's administration has affirmed it is not pursuing, would run counter not only to those previous agreements, but to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, as well as the Washington Declaration.
And now I want to turn to Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida's visit to Korea. Mr. Klingner, it is unprecedented for a Japanese Prime Minister to give a farewell trip to South Korea just 3 weeks before his departure. What tangible impact can be expected other than the two leaders recapping their own achievements in warming the ties?
Well, it is a sort of a goodbye tour for Prime Minister Kishida, since he has announced he won't run for re-election of the president of the Liberal Democratic Party, and thus will no longer be Prime Minister after the vote at the end of the month. So I think it is a way of affirming and trying to continue the trend we've seen of regularizing, operationalizing not only the bilateral relationship between Seoul and Tokyo, but also embedded in the trilateral relationship with Washington. So we've seen certainly security commitments and progress including the real-time sharing of missile information after North Korean launches, but also on economic and diplomatic initiatives. So a lot of them are encapsulated in the Camp David Agreement. So I think it's a way of trying to send a signal that both countries should continue that trend. If you look at the very large number of candidates who are vying to be the successor to Mr. Kishida, all of them will continue all of them are from the LDP, all of them will continue the foreign and security policies. There are some concerns that some of the candidates who might be more conservative, more nationalist, may not share Mr. Kishida's enthusiasm for maintaining the good relations with Seoul as well as further increasing them. So I think that is a little bit of an area of concern given the upcoming Japanese election.
And Mr. Seiler, do you think Prime Minister Kishida's trip to Korea will impact President Yoon's ties with Kishida's successor? And will the change of government in both countries and other domestic issues impact the bilateral relations going forward?
Great questions, and those are like the core questions. I think it's universally perceived that the ROK-Japan relationship is less controversial and less politicized for your average Japanese politician than it is in Korea. It makes continuity and sustainability of improved relations from a Japan perspective easier, whereas in Korea you still have divided opinions on whether Japan has been sufficiently repentant. And you always have that temptation to appeal to anti-Japanese sentiment for domestic political purposes in a way that you don't see as much in Japan. But again, these are two men that have done remarkable work in advancing the relationship, taking some bold diplomatic initiatives, both for pragmatic reasons, in particular because this is so important to the United States. And I think that is what, in part, I think will help kind of act as a kind of a backstop, as it were, to a total backsliding in the relationship should it hit a rough patch. An approach going forward in the relations has to assume there'll be 2 steps forward and 1 step back every once in a while. But for now, I think the Prime Minister's visit to Seoul has laid the groundwork for setting up President Yoon's relationship with whomever emerges as the new Prime Minister.
And Mr. Seiler, Prime Minister Kishida said that he was heartbroken that so many people had such painful and sad experiences under such harsh circumstances, referring to the colonial times. But many Koreans criticize that this is not apology enough. Do you think Prime Minister Kishida should have been more explicit?
That's a decision obviously left to the Prime Minister. And the Korean people have the right to have opinions, and I know that some of my Japanese friends have said, one of the frustrations that they felt is there never will be enough. And of course, none of them have, to me at least, sought to justify what they did. Far from that. They realize the transgressions which were reflected in the occupation and which were addressed in Prime Minister's comments. So maybe it didn't scratch every itch, but again, every statement kind of adds on to the previous one so that we can have a future-oriented look at how to improve Japan, Republic of Korea issues rather than continuing to look back for reasons not to go down this new path.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Mr. Klingner, Mr. Seiler, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the 2 Koreas and the region right here from Washington.